And so that's where nuclear has its value in the system, which is there is an always-on constant source of supply, which can be forward hedged. And there are people, just like any business, right? Market segmentation. There are organizations that need power 24/7.
Are you interested in nuclear energy? What do you think about Australia's leading research agency's investigation on nuclear energy? How can we restructure our understanding on financing nuclear energy? Stay tuned for answers from Andrew Vass.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Andrew Vass, a financial market expert. We will talk about his vision for the future of cities, nuclear energy, second and third rate consequences, financial decisions for clean energy, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Andrew Vass is a financial market expert with experience across equities, cross-asset derivatives, and private capital markets. Andrew is passionate about technology and data. He put both of those into practice by diving into the nuclear rabbit hole after hearing a former client discuss why he had launched a nuclear-dedicated hedge fund. His views do not represent his current employer and are expressed in a personal capacity. And with that, Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your appearance on the podcast. And let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
It's a good question. And I was thinking about this before we hopped on. And I feel like the future of cities is really colored by your own personal experience. And that can incorporate travel, incorporate where you've grown up, and maybe where you've done business. And so if I think about it from my own personal perspective, I grew up in Sydney. I spent largely 20 years living in London, and I've done a lot of business in New York. And so if I try and wrap those three together, I think that's what really covers my views on what the future of a city is. I jotted these down before we joined. In no particular order, I'd written dynamic. I think cities are almost like a living being. They evolve, they change, and they adapt. If I look at Sydney, for example, I grew up in an area where there was very limited public transport. And having come back after being away for 20 years, we now have our first metro that was rolled out, say, 6 months ago. Fantastic development. And having lived in London, I can tell you life without a tube is very different. So to me, I think that's one area of the future of a city is it does need to be dynamic. Our requirements as, I guess, people change over time. And clearly the topic of environment is changing quite a bit. I've written down vibrant. And the reason why I wrote down vibrant is probably speaks to my personality. But I like to feel alive. I like to be alive 24/7. If I'm going to work, I want to be stimulated. I want to have amazing career opportunities. I love lots of noise, lots of chaos going on. It's just my personal preference. But from a city perspective, there needs to be a sense of rhythm, a sense of life and vibrancy in the air. If I look at London, I look at New York, yes, they're well known for their business districts, but there's also amazing creative opportunities. The art scene in both those cities is fantastic, and they add something really special to a city like that. And I feel like something living in Sydney, I feel like that's really lacking here. And so I think that detracts from the vibrancy of living in a city. That's part of the reason why I wrote down vibrancy. And then obviously clean. Clean is clearly important, and there's clean air. I think that goes without saying, and I think the world is moving in that direction. Clean air means healthier living and better health outcomes, and I think that makes for happier people and a happier city. Clearly clean streets. That's one of the marked differences, I think, between Sydney and London. Sydney, to me, is almost spotless. There's rarely any rubbish. The streets are always pretty clean. There's nothing that you really need to navigate, whereas in London, there's just litter everywhere. There's rubbish everywhere. And there's reasons for that. It certainly creates a little bit of an edge. But I think everyone appreciates a little bit of cleanliness. And then obviously cleanliness also from a safety perspective, right? I think everyone likes to be safe in their city. I'd also written down stimulating, but I think I'd somewhat mentioned that in the dynamics of a city. I think it's really important that what makes a city is the ability to be stimulated, whether it's from a career perspective, a personal hobbies perspective, whether it's from the art scene perspective. That's what really makes a city tick to me. Is just having so many different things that you can pull on and go and entertain yourself and keep yourself busy 24/7.
Okay, let's unpack the city a bit, because I think you were mainly focusing on what the city means to you now, and then I will tease out a bit more about the future of the city itself. First, you were talking about New York, London, and Sydney, very small cities. And I would love to know whether there is a lower limit where you differentiate between cities and towns. What is the differentiating factor when you say that this is the city and this is just a town?
I think for me, a city is a large metropolis with a working public transport system, lots of integration with the rest of the globe through transport, whether that's through flight, trains, multiple forms of transport. I think for me, that's what really defines a city. And then almost that 24/7 type of culture. I think once you get out of that construct, that for me denotes the shift from a city to a town.
It's very interesting, especially because of your background, that you are talking about metropolises, large metropolises, because you are an economist and you are a financial expert. Because economics and I think financial experts have, I would assume, very different understanding of what the city is.
Maybe. Look, one of the things that comes to me from economics is economies of scale, right? And I think is one of the critical aspects that you get within a city is, if I think of London, for example, I vividly remember moving there and they're in the process of rolling out high-speed internet cable. But if you think of the population density meant that there were multiple providers of that high-speed cable, and the cost of high-speed internet access was significantly lower, and in fact is significantly lower than what I currently pay here in Sydney for my high-speed access. And so I think from an economist's perspective, economies of scale are something that I think really do denote and separate a city and a town. And maybe that's part and parcel of population density as well.
We are getting into an era where the things you just mentioned, internet speed, entertainment, opportunities, are not necessarily crowded in the city in itself. Is the city changing in your understanding in the meaning of the term itself?
No, I don't think the city's changing. I think ultimately, maybe if I was to think philosophically, human species are quite social species, and creativity, the water bubbler conversation, we know all the cliches. How often do you bring people together and you can innovate, you can create, you can draw on people with different experiences, different perspectives, different outlooks, and you can blend all of that together and come up with something completely different. I don't think that cities are changing. I know that we've had COVID and, hey, I'm working from home today, or apparently working from home at the moment. Working from home, I think, has added somewhat to working optionality. I think will provide more flexibility, but I think ultimately at its core, we are social beings and we create more when we're together than we do when we're apart. And you can think of all these old sayings, right? Like a problem shared is a problem halved. If you're working from home, are you really sharing those problems? And I know that it can be different for different industries and different roles, but ultimately I think at an aggregate level, at a macro level, from an economics perspective, I don't think the nature of cities are changing. I think we like to be together with people. I think we generally enjoy each other's company. Going out to a club when you're 20, do you want to be in a packed nightclub with sweat dripping off the roof, lights going off, people drinking? Hell yes. I don't want to be out in some farm, there's not many people around. I know some people do that and they enjoy that, but I think in aggregate, I don't think cities have changed from that perspective, and I'd be very surprised if they change further. And if you look at the conversation, at least from a Sydney perspective, look, we're talking a lot about population density up here, increasing population density. And personally, I'm a big fan of that. Having more people brings more vibrancy, brings more opportunities. And I think about where I grew up as a little boy was southwestern suburbs of Sydney. It was an area that was built after World War II. Classic quarter-acre block, red brick house. But there was nothing. There's just houses. There's no sense of community. There was no community hall. There were no community activities. There was no central meeting point for a community to come together and create some kind of shared bond and evolve together. And I think that's where density can bring some of those opportunities together, because if you have more people in the same area, you bring them together because more people want to have a coffee, or they might want to go to the pub and socialize. And so you start to bring those social aspects together. And that's where I take it back to the philosophical point at the beginning, where we're still social beings. I don't think the cities have changed. And if you look at, I can speak more to London than I can to New York, but they have similar processes, which are, if you think of the UK, the best and the brightest, they all get drawn into London. Finish university and they want to come into London. They want to work in London. and everyone lives in a small little flat, goes out, has a lot of fun, eats at great restaurants, works really hard, meets a partner in the nuclear sense, pun intended, has a child, and the inevitable conversation then becomes from a London perspective, and even in New York, do I want to stay in the city or do I want to move out into what they call the home counties in London? Or in New York, there's the classic, do I want to move to New Jersey or do I want to move up to Connecticut, and do I want to commute? And so there's this cycle of life that continues. But I think if you look at both of those cities, by drawing in the young people and the innovators and putting them all into one melting pot, I think that's what really creates that vibrancy within the city and the creativity. And so that's the reason why I just don't see those things shifting. If you're in the UK and you come from the Cotswolds, 2 hours out of London, and you can come from a small village of 50 people in the Cotswolds, you don't want to spend your entire time there. And don't get me wrong, I love watching Clarkson's Farm. Jeremy's in his, mid-60s, and he's hilarious. But if I was 25, other than his offsider, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, I don't really want to be hanging out in the Cotswolds, right? I want to go to London. It's amazing. I think that trend will always be with us, and I think it's a natural human evolution. And if you look at the way we're structured, you're in Melbourne, I'm in Sydney. I was actually down at Melbourne University last week. Melbourne University is very close to the centre of town. Sydney University is very close to the centre of town. We have our prime post-school educational institutions in the city. And the reason for that, I think, is ultimately it condenses opportunity and it creates that vibrancy.
This is the city. And during describing the city, you came back to the description you gave us for the future of the city, that it's dynamic, it's vibrant, it's 24/7, and it's clean. That's a very interesting observation. We might get back to that. But
I should have added one more, affordable.
The question is, what does the future of the city mean to you? Because these are currently existing, except for affordability. What is the future of the city itself?
I think let's put affordability into the future. I think it's part of the socio-economic conversation that we're having here in Sydney and probably more broadly in Australia. So I think that's an important aspect of it. I think that we will have higher density, and that goes part and parcel with affordability, in my opinion. It will be clean. I guess you could say it's becoming cleaner, and that's from multiple aspects, but I think we could probably simplify that down to transportation and energy. People are using hybrids, people are using EVs, so there's less exhaust coming out into the air. And then quite clearly our energy generation is switching from largely a coal-driven system to other forms of clean energy at the moment. So we are becoming cleaner, and I think Sydney certainly has a benefit of already having clean streets. I think all of those are the future of the city. Imagine an environment where you can walk down the road and there are no fumes. Fantastic. How many times have you walked past a diesel truck and felt a little nauseous at the back from the fumes coming out? Putting aside anyone's personal preference on what we should do on policy, it's fantastic just to be able to walk down the street and not have to breathe fumes. And I think that's a huge win. And actually Australia has very high incidence of asthma, if my memory is any good. So cleaning up air also has positive feedback loops into things like health outcomes as well. And then I would guess there's probably an extension into educational outcomes and things like that. And then I think economic opportunity, that really has to be part of the future. We have the majority of our people live in a city. The majority of the people need opportunities within that city in the future. I know we have some great primary industries in this country, but if you look at the majority of the innovations that are happening across the world at the moment, the majority of those are largely the ones that we all know and love. The Amazons of the world, the Googles, the Netflix, they're all city innovations.
We know what the city means to you. We know how you imagine the future of the city itself. What are your 3 biggest fears or concerns regarding the future of the city?
We're the exact opposite of dynamic. We become static. We become stuck. Time passes us by. Evolution passes us by. We live in a highly globalized world. If we live in a static environment, your best and brightest are just going to pack their bags and move. It's not hard. I don't think it's well known, but Australia has a visa program in the US. There's 10,000 visas that you can get every single year for Australians to move to the US. It's called the E3 visa program. It's very simple to move. The Brits happily take Australians, right? There's always a way for people to move offshore. And so I think Stacey's is the one thing that really scares me the most. And we're seeing that. You look at the conversations that are happening online, particularly around housing. People are very negative on the outlook for Australia. There's an underlying tone of depression. And I think with that Stacey's and that frustration with the cost element, you're now starting to see some of that percolate up into politics. And so as we start to see the frustration of the political class not delivering what the Americans would call Main Street or the average person desires, affordable housing, economic opportunity, good living, people start to push for the extremes because they're looking for a solution. I think we're almost living our fear, or my fear to some extent at the moment, because having lived away from this country for such a long time and then having come back only recently, it's interesting to see, even my wife says, how much closer the rest of the world has gotten over the time that we spent in London. Your ability to interact with Asia or the US, Latin America, Africa, Europe, very easy, seamless, integrated, everything moves around quickly. There's an innovation in the US that moves to Europe or vice versa. It happens very quickly. Whereas here it feels like it's the cost of geography. It feels like we're so far removed from the rest of the world that we're almost not getting left behind, but we're getting dragged by the rest of the world, but there's a rubber band and it's stretching further and further and further. And it feels to me like we're becoming so segregated from the rest of the world. And that for me is the most challenging. That's the one thing that I really do fear for, because when you start to get the populace frustrated, then you start to think about political and cultural revolutions, pushback on the elite, changing political dynamics. You're seeing some signs of that now. Some of it's healthy. I think it's Sydney Yimby recently, I think it was yesterday, had some success. I think quadrupling or quintupling the amount of housing that was going to be built. I think it was in Camperdown potentially, which is a great outcome, but it shouldn't be that difficult. People are screaming for cheaper housing, but there's no housing. Your life in Sydney at the moment, if you don't spend $3 million, $4 million, that's a lot of money. What's your day-to-day look like for the average person? I might live in western suburbs. I might drive 40 minutes in the morning. I might drive 40 minutes in the afternoon. I've got a mortgage to pay off, which is costing me a lot at the moment because of inflation. You got a lot of burden there, right? And that's where I think that Stacey's is really the thing that, I know you said three, but I've really touched on one. It's the one thing that really concerns me the most. Besides the metro that I touched on, the public transport system hasn't evolved really that much in 20 years. Yes, we've got the light rail, but that only goes in a very segregated two places largely. We haven't really thought about building integrated transport across a very complex geography to move 5 or 6 million people around systematically every day, leveraging economies of scale, building into a nighttime economy. And that's where I fear or worry the most about futures of the city, because people will only take so much. And then once you break the people, there's a response. And that response can be many and varied. And I think we're starting to see some signs of that.
I don't know whether you have heard of The Beginning of Infinity, a book by David Deutsch. He talks about that human creativity is one of the best things that ever happened. And he partially talks about sustainability, how it's not a necessarily good thing, but also he talks about the dynamic and the static societies. And it's a good reminder to look around whether we are living in a static or a dynamic society. Coming from a, I would say, more static society, Australia seems so dynamic, to be honest. But I can also understand why it seems from the inside a bit more static. Also, when we came to Australia, everybody has been saying since that Australia is 30 years behind. But there are such good inventions coming out from Australia. One of my previous interviewees, Matt Farrell, talked about that although Australia as a country might seem behind, the individuals, what they are doing in inventions, that's freaking awesome.
We're touching on some big things here, but I'd say, I guess if we get into that sustainability question a little bit, I think people underestimate human ingenuity, or in financial markets, we would generally say people are short human ingenuity. That's always dangerous. Now, if you look at the pace of AI adoption, actually I posted on Twitter the other day, AI adoption is faster than the PC and faster than the internet, just to give you some sense of how quickly it's actually scaling. And so our world is going to change dramatically and at pace. And so I think you never want to be short human ingenuity. And yet I find that many of our policymakers and the direction and policy stances that we have taken implicitly short ingenuity, which is very depressing. And I think to your point on individual competence, Australians have, in fact, if you go offshore, you will find Australians in very significant roles running major divisions, major businesses everywhere. Australians are very capable at an individual level. But I think what you're touching on is there's a difference between the individual and there's a difference between culture. And I know we're here to talk about nuclear, but there's actually a great example here in Australia in nuclear. Australia designed the world's leading laser enrichment technology in Lucas Heights in Sydney. World's leading. To get it commercialized, they've had to sell half of the technology under license with the Americans to a Canadian company called Cameco. And then Cameco is commercializing that technology in Washington State in the USA. Fully designed here, developed here in Australia. Brilliant solution. No one else in the world's been able to do it. Straight in ingenuity. But we haven't commercialized it. Why? We have a ban, first of all. And then secondly, I would say, putting my financial markets cap on, we have a very conservative risk culture here. If there's one thing that I love about having worked with the Americans love to take risk. Love to take risk. All day. If I'm going to make $1 billion out of it, okay, let's sit down and figure out how we make this happen. And there's that can-do attitude. There's no worry about it going wrong. If it goes wrong, they've got this brilliant process called Chapter 11. Then a different set of investors will come in and they'll buy the technology and they'll have another go. Learning by doing. We don't have that culture here. And I think that's one of the most interesting aspects to me, is that touches on your point around, I think, implicitly the difference between the individual and the collective. We have highly capable people individually, but the collective culture doesn't seem to be able to deliver the best possible outcome.
It's not just Australia. So I come from Hungary, and that's the same. Hungarians have been known to create amazing inventions as collective, just individuals. I know that feeling as well. We'll get back to nuclear, but first, after this doom and gloom, what are the 3 biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities for you?
I think I've already touched on some of them indirectly. I'm just going to focus on the one I'm living in at the moment. Public transport, greatest enabler. We can talk about cost and we can have all these conversations around cost. And I think we spend too much time focusing on cost. We don't talk about value. What's the value of having a functional mass metro system that can move millions of people? The ability to move around a city without needing a car creates a cleaner city in and of itself. It's cheaper to use. It's cleaner because we can use electricity instantaneously. And obviously we're decarbonizing our electricity system. It's social, so it works for many people. So overall, there's economic benefits. There's health benefits. There's economies of scale benefits, and it enables more mobility. So if you think of the M1 here in Sydney, it's like an arc that cuts through the CBD, but then bends south and bends north. And that's great. It covers a lot of people. But the art of a metro system isn't just having a single line. It's having a full network that allows you to interchange and move about east, west, north, south very quickly, very simply, little friction, and for little cost. There's a model in economics that talks about the velocity of money. You can think about the velocity of people. The more people can move, the more opportunity people can take for themselves. And so I think for me, the future of cities is really, particularly in Sydney, mass transportation through functional metro, through a functioning network of metros is absolutely critical. I could dream up a plan myself. Clean energy is clearly a big component of the futures of city. We need to decarbonize. I think that clearly our environment is changing, and removing things like coal from our energy system has extraordinary benefits longer term, particularly on the health side. But they also bring with them unique challenges. And some of those challenges are what we're beginning to experience at the moment. And so if you broadly look at our energy system, as we're trying to decarbonize, we've limited our opportunities, speaking to that cultural point I made before. And so we've adopted a wholly VRE, variable renewable only approach to energy. And yes, it achieves the environmental requirements that we've got. But there's a holy trinity that we're dealing with here. There's environmental, there's cost, or call it economic, and then there's energy security. And at the moment of that holy trinity, we have put environmental at the top. We have seen broadly over the 20 years since we started on this renewable journey, we've removed coal, we've removed baseload from the system, and costs have gone up. It's very simple. And so that is one of the greatest opportunities for cities at the moment, because if you think about what we consume as people and as individuals and as a city, we consume extraordinary amounts of energy. What does it take for a metro system? You need electricity. What do you need for an EV? You need a boatload of electricity. And so clean energy, lots of energy, and energy abundance, as we're hearing quite regularly now out of the US with the change in the administration, these are critical elements for the futures of cities. And I think at this point in time, I live in Sydney. I pay a peak rate, 60 cents per kilowatt hour, because I don't have solar. Now I get an 18% discount, so I think off the cuff that gets me to about 52 or 53 cents. That's eye-wateringly expensive energy. And so the futures of cities are very dependent upon the amount of energy they consume. And if you walk around any city, think of all of the lights. I can think of Piccadilly Circus with the big TVs up just because that's the first thing that comes to mind. Or is it Madison Square Gardens where they've got similar things in the US, right? Or you can think of Sydney Tower where they've got the lights that go around the tower all night. That's electricity. It's energy. The more expensive you make it, the less people want to use it. The less people want to use it, the less dynamic, the less opportunity, the less vibrancy there is in your cities. So energy becomes a critical part of your conversation. And then it becomes a question about the economies of scale. How do we actually drive down costs of energy so that we can drive all of these things? If I can halve the cost of my electricity, we're going to get the paradox, which everyone talks about at the moment, Joven's paradox. If I halve the cost of electricity, people are just going to use a lot more of it. But what does that mean? People actually have a better life. And I think that's critical. And these systems, you need to apply a little bit of economic thought to them. You can't just apply an environmental lens and forget the economics and forget how the economics and the finance work. And quite often I find in these conversations that we can talk endlessly about decarbonization and things like that. But if there's no economy, there is no city. It really is quite straightforward. Because if there's no economy, there's no jobs. And we're seeing it. I think it was SPC, the canning operation down in Victoria, were complaining about the cost of energy rising so much that they may have to consider restructuring. And we're seeing closures across the board. So energy becomes a critical construct in the enablement of healthy living and economic opportunity and vibrancy within the city.
You mentioned something very interesting when you talked about public transport. And as a financial expert, it was really surprising that you mentioned value over cost. Could you talk a bit more about this regarding public transport or energy? Just how did you arrive to this approach as a financial expert? How can we apply this thinking to these problems and these challenges and these opportunities as well?
There's a couple of analogies. I think we can think of one immediately from a Sydney perspective, non-energy related to start with, which is Sydney Opera House. Cost a fortune, massively over budget, delayed. I think it was by a decade off the cuff. We probably want to check that. Does anyone talk about how much it cost anymore? No one talks about how much it cost anymore. But how many tourists come to Sydney and take a picture of the Sydney Opera House? I used to have my end of year school presentations at the Opera House. My wife has taken our 3-year-old daughter to the Opera House for some plays. My wife's taken my 12-year-old daughter to the Opera House for some plays. The value of creative industries having a home, the value of school presentations, the value of that facility for tourism and advertising for the country has been far more consequential than the costs that were associated with the build. And look, we can extend that thesis a little bit into the energy space and say, look, what was the Sydney Opera House? Really, it was first of a kind, only of a kind, really. But we can get into the nuclear conversation and say first of a kind is always going to be expensive because you just haven't built it before. But what happens if you build the same thing? Carbon copy and over again. Maybe not a great analogy, but it's a little bit like Lego. I'm pretty sure everyone's had Lego or Duplo. And you remember you get to Christmas, you take the wrapping off, you get the box out, you unpack it. There's a little paper instruction booklet there. And it might take you, call it an hour, because you'll go through from page 1 to page 42. You put it all together and you've built something. 3 weeks later, you'll go back and rebuild it all over again. And it's not going to take you an hour because you've done it before and you remember how to do it. It might take you half an hour this time, or it might take you 45 minutes, but it's going to be quicker because you've done it. And it's the exact same thing that you're doing over and over again. And so this is where I get to the value and the cost conversation, right? Which is to say, there is a value in building that thing up front. Yes, we know it's going to be expensive. Yes, we know it's going to take longer than everyone expects. But the value of that is we've invested in training, we've invested in skills, and we've invested in knowledge. And then we can leverage that asset, redeploy it again, and continue to monetize it and get value from that asset that we created. And we see this all over the world, all of the time. You'll quite often hear, for example, in the nuclear space, nuclear is insanely expensive. And you'll hear everyone roll out the numbers. Vogel, $32 billion. Hinkley Point C, 43 billion pounds. The one that many people don't really want to talk about is Baraka in the UAE, which was $27 billion. And I have that from someone who actually works at Baraka. I think the public number is about 24 or 25. And then you'll hear about the one up in Finland. You'll hear the one in Flamanville in France. But the three I touched on, Vogel, Hinkley Point, and Baraka, are the key ones to focus on. And why? They built the same reactors multiple times at the same plants. Now, there were mistakes made in the process, but if I just go with the cost value thing for now, if you look at Vogel 3, the AP1000, $32 billion total project cost. But Vogtle 4, the second reactor, was a carbon copy of Vogtle 3. It was 30% cheaper than Vogtle 3. Now, interestingly, in the US, they've only got, I think it's 5 or 6 carbon copy reactors, which is crazy. But there's that learning benefit, which you will never hear of. If we get to Hinkley Point C, 1 and 2 are still under construction. But you can go and watch the EDF YouTube video, and they'll tell you that they're running anywhere between 20 and 30% faster on the second reactor at Hinkley Point C than they are on the first one. That's clearly cost saving, and everyone tends to forget that there was a 1-year delay because of COVID when they stopped work. They'll tell you about some of the processes they have even made 75% more efficient between reactor 1 and reactor 2. If you get to Barak, reactor 4 was 50% cheaper than reactor 1. And so this is where I talk about the difference between value and cost. There was a cost in all of these up front, but then they created the skills, the experience, and the learning. And we can see that those have been leveraged by building the exact same carbon copy reactor afterwards. And so that learning by doing process is absolutely critical. And we often underrate that process through negative headline. That learning by doing process, I think, is the critical part around the cost conversation, but it's actually the first reactor that gives you the value part. You can't get that learning without doing the first one. And is there a problem investing in skills? Is there a problem in creating new industries? I don't think there is. There should be, right? This is stuff that we've done before, but we've lost our chutzpah in the West a little bit. If you look at all those projects, nuclear has a bad name to some extent, and rightly because of the construction costs. But I think the question isn't what the cost is. The question is, why did they cost so much? And we never hear that addressed in the mainstream media or even online. All you will get is, Vogtle cost 32 billion. So that's going to be, call it 50 billion in Australia. But to me, what's more important in a decisioning process is, why did it cost 32 billion in the US? And when you start to dig into it, there's a lot of commonality, particularly between Hinkley Point C and the Vogtle projects. The West had not built nuclear for 30 years. So unsurprisingly, when they decided they wanted to build nuclear again, and they went to find labour, all the people who'd built nuclear before, they retired. They're in their nursing homes. Some of the Brits are actually out here in Australia, spending their retirement out here. They're retired. They don't build nuclear anymore. So there was no skills. Secondly, because we hadn't built it, there was no supply chain. And then thirdly, and most importantly, the reactors that were built at Hinkley Point and at Vogtle had never been built and operated before in full completion. Now, the reactor at Hinkley Point C, yes, there was one being built in Finland and there was one being built in France, but none of them had been completed. None of them had been operating. None of them had completed a fuel cycle. And there were significant changes between all of them. You can talk about the base mats had changed, and then there was design changes for the UK. So they're all essentially first-of-a-kind reactor with first-of-a-kind construction, with first-of-a-kind supply chain. Toxic mix. You're literally starting an industry from scratch. It was always going to be a disaster. And I think that's where it gets really interesting to then go and look at Baraka. They brought in experienced people on the EPC on the construction side. They built a reactor that had already been built before and was operational and had a supply chain. And they built the same reactor at the same spot 4 times. Not twice, 4 times. And so that, to me, I think is the clear distinction in terms of the decisioning process around the nuclear conversation. Is not to say it costs insane amounts of money. It's to say, first of all, why did those builds cost so much money? And will that cost be replicated in an Australian setting? And I think the answer to that is, if you look at the policy proposal that's on the table at the moment, there's 2 reactors. There's the AP1000, which was built at Vogtle, which is the American one. And then there is the APR 1400, which is from Korea, but it's actually effectively an American reactor. It's actually the one that's out in Palo Verde in Arizona. Both of those reactors that have been proposed for Australia, they're already under operation. They've been built elsewhere and have completed a fuel cycle, or will have completed a fuel cycle before we even contemplate nuclear for Australia. And so I think those are really important parts in the decision-making process that really dictate what that initial cost is going to be. And those are manageable decisions. So I think if I was to think about the political construct at the moment, I think the policy proposal that's on the table largely has the right foundations. We know, looking at each of the projects that we've had around the world, that there are learning benefits. Every single one of those projects I just touched on, where there are multiple reactors built, the costs go down without fail. And almost a similar amount, right? If you think of HPC, Hinkley Point, 20 to 30%, call it 25% faster on the second one. Second reactor at Vogtle was 30% cheaper, right? The fourth one at Barak was 50% cheaper. They're big numbers. I think from a cost perspective, we can make a good decision, which is largely already on the table, which is to say we only build reactors that are already in operation and have been built somewhere else in the world. That immediately reduces the construction risk and timetable. Now, you can look at Vogel, just to give you some sense, had multiple design changes, thousands of design changes going on in the middle of construction. They poured the wrong foundation, literally, can't make it up, poured the wrong mix of concrete and steel. They'd submitted a change to the regulator, but it hadn't been approved. They poured the new one without the approval. That was a 7-month delay. Imagine how much that costs. All these things are manageable and can be overcome. Everyone else has made the mistake. I think the critical challenge for Australia is labour. We're going to have to import some skilled labour, whether it's from the US, the UK, or Korea. We're going to need to import some skilled labour. Everything needs to be nuclear grade, whether it's concrete, steel, etc. We don't have that skills. But to me, there is a cost to that, but that's an investment. And as I touched on before, that becomes the value in building all of the reactors that come afterwards. You're investing in skills. You're creating an asset to then go and monetize afterwards. And that becomes the value. And if you think about, for example, people will say Vogel overnight capital cost was $15,000 per kilowatt. Okay, 30% cheaper. What's 10% of 15,000? It's 1,500 times 3, that's 4,500. So 10,500, a 30% cost reduction gets you to $10,500 per kilowatt, right? That's just above the $10,000 that the Liberal Party used in their recent modelling. That 30% isn't unreasonable because all of the projects I've touched on had that 30% learning rate. So the critical part is really where you start. And so that's where I think the cost value conversation comes to me. Everyone gets stuck at the cost up front. That to me is a value that we then go and monetize afterwards.
Thank you very much for the description, because it gives really the idea that we shouldn't just think about the first rate consequences, but the second and third order consequences as well. At the same time, I would like to also know whether you have any estimation on what would nuclear energy cost on the consumer side. Because I've attended a nuclear energy panel where they talked about that. For example, Australia's main research institute, the CSIRO, created the cost estimate, and they said that the highest cost for people to have nuclear. But it's about building it, not using it. So I'm curious whether you have any estimate on what would it mean to have nuclear energy in Australia for the consumers.
First, I can tell you that the CSIRO do a very poor job. This is something that is a financial model with assumptions, and it's something that I've dealt with in my life almost every single day. The CSIRO model is incredibly basic, is poorly understood, and if Paul was working for me, who is the author of it, in a previous life, he would have been fired from our organisation for such sloppy work. I'll give you a couple of points on that. First of all, it's a financial model, and so it uses an interest rate. It needs to use an interest rate to essentially generate what's the required return. They use a type of interest rate called a real interest rate. That's what we would call an inflation-adjusted interest rate. The model makes no reference to the fact that the current proposition for nuclear, which I believe is the right one, is a government-constructed nuclear program. And so the first thing you do in financial markets is you get a model from an analyst and you go, okay, whatever. I really don't care what you think. All I care about is what's happening in the real world and how do I make money out of this. In the real world, it's very straightforward. The government borrows at 10 years, and I probably should have looked this up, it's probably about 4.3%. Very simplistically, we could say, what is the RBA's inflation target? The inflation target is 2 to 3%. We take the midpoint of 2 to 3%, it's 2.5%. You divide 1.043 by 1.025. That gives you about 1.75%. So that is the government's real cost of borrow. The CSIRO model assumes 6%. Okay? 6%. The CSIRO makes no distinction at all between the cost of financing and the interest rate that's used, between private and public. So this has extraordinary implications on the modelling price. And this is something, and I had emailed Paul Graham, and I have it in writing, that the interest rate in the Gen Cost model is a real interest rate, okay? And so the process I just did then is what's called the Fisher method, to just convert to a real interest rate. So that's number one. So if you think about the interest rate alone, the CSIRO assumes an interest rate that's 3 times greater than the government's interest rate. So something that's very capital intensive upfront makes an extraordinary difference. The second one, which gets to the point of value, time span. CSIRO assumes 30 years. Now, you can do that in a financial model. That's actually fine. But then what we would talk about is residual value is the term. So at the end of 30 years, if you have an asset that has a value again, you should incorporate that value into the model. If you're a business, you build something, it takes you 30 years to pay it off, and you've got an asset and it's still functioning and working, I can sell that for something. That's part of my return metrics. That's very simple cash flow modeling that will be done in every corporate institution. The CSIRO has no residual value for 30 years. Zero. None. Now, we know that's factually incorrect because you look around the world and you can see reactors that are built operating for 50 years. And we know that the AP1000, for example, has a design life of 60, probably more likely to go to at least 80, if not 100, given that many of the reactors in the US are now being licensed to 80 years. So we can see that the operating life assumption that the CSIRO uses is just wrong. It just doesn't make any sense at all whatsoever. It's just simple common sense. So that's another adjustment that you would make. And then the other problem with the CSIRO argument, and one, again, that I've had with Paul Graham on email, is what we call the capacity factor. It's a utilization rate. So simplistically, if I can generate a megawatt every hour today, that would be 24 megawatt hours of energy that I've generated. And if my capacity to generate was also 24 megawatt hours, then that would be 100% capacity factor. If I only generated 12, but I was able to generate 24, then my capacity factor would be 50. Right? So it's a functionality of how much I generate versus time and availability to generate. So the CSIRO uses 83% utilization at the top end, and then it uses 53%. And I questioned Paul on this. We had a number of email exchanges. And so I sent him a lot of data. The OECD average for nuclear is 82%. The US average for nuclear is 93% and has been above 90% for the last decade. So the range from the CSIRO, first of all, just doesn't correlate with the rest of the world. Secondly, actually, when I dug into it with Paul, and you can read it in Gen Cost in one of the footnotes, the capacity factor estimates don't actually come from nuclear at all. CSIRO says nuclear's baseload, closest baseload we have in Australia is coal, therefore I'm going to use a coal estimate. So the 83% comes from coal. But where it gets even better is the low end estimate of 53% is 60% capacity factor, again, taken from a coal plant. And then they add a risk factor of 10%. And that's how they get to 53%. So essentially what they say is, we're not going to look at what happens in the rest of the world. We're just going to look at a baseload technology here in Australia, which is coal. And we're just going to use those numbers and we're going to put those in our model. And that's what worked. And Paul and I had a number of email exchanges together. And it was abundantly clear that he wasn't changing his mind. That just doesn't fly. Nuclear is nuclear, coal is coal. If you make a basic assumption in financial markets, you will just go and look at what the technology is and say, this is how it works across the rest of the world. How's it going to work in this setting? You don't look at a completely different technology and then apply to different technology. And by the way, what's also interesting is because all of the coal plants have been told that they're going to be closed down and be replaced by variable renewable energy, the plants have then reacted to that and said, I'm not going to invest in my kit. So therefore the plants themselves have become unreliable. So it's self-fulfilling in a way to use the coal, because then they use the coal, and having told the coal plants that they're going away, they haven't invested, so therefore the reliability goes down, therefore the capacity factor goes down. But what we've already seen in Victoria and New South Wales is coal's not going anywhere. Loy Yang got an extension, Eraring got an extension, they're going to get more extension. If you do a basic analysis, which is called the capture rate, which essentially looks at what's the price tomorrow for electricity, and then look at what each of the generation sources actually achieved versus that 1 day ahead price when they get to that 1 day ahead. What you're actually seeing in Australia at the moment is solar is 50% and below. So if the price tomorrow, if we're looking at Wednesday, I think today's Tuesday, so if we're looking at Wednesday's price tomorrow and it's $100 a megawatt hour, 50% capture rate for solar means that tomorrow actually what solar will receive for its generation is $50. Coal at the moment across the eastern seaboard is operating somewhere between about 110 to 120%. So using the same logic, that actually means that coal tomorrow will generate $110 to $120 per megawatt hour of its generation. Again, this difference between value and cost. Coal is the most valuable energy source on our grid right now because it's the only thing that is firm and dispatchable. And so that's the key value. Now I keep going back to this concept of value, right? There is a value in having this type of baseload resource or this firm resource in the system. But what I should say is when you change those assumptions in the model, nuclear becomes cheaper than wind, offshore and onshore wind. It's night and day, particularly with offshore. You shouldn't be building offshore straight away. And we're somewhat seeing that now. No one really wants to build offshore in Australia. And it makes sense. It's too far to send the boats down from Asia to do all the installation and then send them back to Asia because you've got to pay a day rate. So it just creates an insane amount of cost. So the CSIRO model, once you start to change the assumptions, it really starts to give you better economic outcomes. It's a useful model, and there's the famous saying that I popularized on my first tweet, which was from George Box. All models are wrong, some are useful. The CSIRO model's useful, but its assumptions are very wrong. And when you start to adjust the assumptions to real world, you start to get the output that you need. The other thing I should say is the CSIRO model is not modeling the price that you and I pay for energy. The CSIRO model is a crude way of trying to model what an investor would require to build those types of plants. So if I'm going to build offshore wind, what's the price per megawatt hour that I need to return my capital and things like that? You then need to compound on that for what you and I pay, the network. You'll often hear transmission and distribution. You can think about that as the roads and the highways, I think is the great analogy that people use. Transmission is the highway, the big towers that you'll drive past on motorways that have multiple big cables. That's taking all your energy from, say, Loy Yang in Victoria into Melbourne. And then when it gets into Melbourne, it goes onto the distribution network, and that's your side roads that you use to get down to your house. And so if you look in your bill, the greatest cost in your bill right now is not generation, it's the network. Greatest cost is getting energy to you, not creating it. And one thing that people don't focus on in this debate is that's the largest piece of the bill stack. A chap called Ben Beatty online who's done a fantastic job of popularizing this. How do I make that segment go down? And I think what people don't understand is you pay for your network in two ways. You pay fixed charge, standing charge. Everyone pays a daily rate. I don't know, it might be $1, right? So $365 a year, you'll pay, and that's for your network charges. But in an attempt to make the system fair, they also add your network charges on to the actual cost of energy. So if you look at your cost of energy, I'm guessing you might pay somewhere between, 20 cents and 40 cents maybe. You look at the average price in Australia at the moment off the cuff, I think it's around about 30 cents. I don't have it up in front of me at the moment. 30 cents is $300 a megawatt hour. It doesn't cost $300 a megawatt hour. The average prices in Australia are on $300 a megawatt hour. So there's lots of fees embedded in that. Network operators, through the regulator, are mandated to receive a fixed return. So if I have $10 billion in assets, the regulator might say I'm entitled to receive 9%. Let's make it 10% just to make the conversation easy. That means I am allowed to retrieve from customers $1 billion a year for my network investments. How do we pay for that? There's the standing charge, but then there's obviously the part that's attached to your variability. And again, if I go back to a toll road analogy here, toll roads you pay as you use. I drive on the toll road, I pay my $5 toll and I move on. What happens with network though is you pay for it all the time, even if your energy doesn't necessarily come from there. But what's more important is because it's also a component of your variable cost or your energy charge, if you consume less energy from the grid, everyone else still has to make that $1 billion up. And so what we're starting to see, and it's becoming a social issue now, is that if you've got solar, effectively what's happening is you're avoiding part of your network costs and you're actually creating a societal problem. Because who are the people that can't get in aggregate solar? People like me who rent, so I have no solar. Or the weakest in society, they can't afford to put solar panels on their roof. So actually what we've ended up doing is we've got the weakest in society subsidizing the wealthiest in society. And so that's what's happening here is we're getting into a situation whereby as more people put panels up, cost of the network doesn't change. So if you think about my network cost is flat at $1 billion that I need to get out, but we're consuming less, is it my denominator, I always get it wrong, is going down, right? Everyone else has to pay more for that network. And so this is what's happening, talking about futures of cities. Like, we're making people poor because we haven't applied any economic rationality into our energy choices at the moment. And so that then propagates. If you're listening to this on your iPhone, you might have charged it using electricity in the office. If your office electricity is 30 kilowatt cents and you're in an energy intensive business, the difference between 30 and 33 cents could put you out of business. And so unfortunately, what we've gotten into is a situation whereby, as I go back to that Holy Trinity, where we've prioritized environmentalism or the environmental outcome. We haven't then thought about, if I put a panel on my roof, what does that actually do to the rest of the system? And so to tie this back to the CSIRO doesn't model any of these outcomes. It doesn't model the full system cost. And that is, if you go and look at, for example, the only full system cost that's been modeled in Australia is the Net Zero Australia report. The cost of a variable renewable system, 4 to 5 trillion. 4 to 5 trillion. That is the only full system cost. And if people are listening to this, I'd be curious to know how many people have actually heard of or seen Net Zero Australia. My guess is not many. Why? Because the government and people who advocate for the renewable situation don't want you to know what that number is. But that's the direction of travel we're going in. And so the CSIRO does not model the full system cost. And all the CSIRO does realistically is to try and generate a capital cost figure that then goes to the integrated system plan. I'm not going to touch on the integrated system plan, but again, that is not a full system plan either. Everyone should follow Aidan Morrison. He is deep in the weeds on this topic. Again, that is another failed piece of modeling in our energy system. Every time you hear of the CSIRO and people leaning on the CSIRO, I hate to tell you, but they don't understand how to use a financial model.
Thank you so much for the description and the explanation. Nuclear help with the network cost?
Take the $1 billion. We build some transmission. Victoria wants to build offshore wind. You need transmission to take it from the ocean onto the grid. Offshore wind, getting back to that capacity factor, is around 50%, give or take. Depending on where you look at in the North Sea or other parts, it could be 45, it could be 55, there or thereabouts. It's about 50%. If you've got a transmission cable buried in the ocean and it's only working half the time, what are you doing with the other half of the time? So simplistically put, the cost of transmission for offshore wind, assuming it generates 50% of the time, is twice as expensive to move the actual energy from the wind turbine. Why? Because if I looked at a nuclear plant that might be sited up in Eraring, for example, just because that comes top of mind, a nuclear plant is going to operate 100% of the time at 100% capacity until it needs to refuel. I'm using all of that transmission as much as I possibly can. So the cost of moving electrons generated from nuclear is a lot cheaper than using transmission from offshore wind. We need less transmission. The other thing we don't talk about in Australia at all, reconductoring. Fancy word. What does it actually really mean? It just means replacing or upgrading the cables, the transmission cables, on the existing transmission assets. You can buy new reconductors that will double your capacity and drop your losses by 30%. All right, so you can double your capacity and reduce the losses that you experience on those lines by 30%. If I think of Eraring, because it's in New South Wales, it's 2.8 gigawatts off the cuff. We could double the transmission to take 5.6 gigawatts. We don't need new transmission. We don't need to drive through all of these rural places and create extraordinary amounts of angst and anger because we want to have offshore wind because that's all we're allowed to have. So the more transmission you build, essentially what's happening is the government then allows those companies like Transgrid to say, I have a future claim on Fanny's money. That's all that's happening. It's guaranteed because they go to the regulator says 9%. What's actually happening is the regulator's saying you can have 9% and Fanny's portion every single year. They're just writing that against you. So these companies are essentially taking streams of revenues and writing debt against you and you don't even know it. And so this is where nuclear can help is it reduces the amount of transmission, which makes the system overall more efficient, which gets us back to economies of scale. And so that's critical in terms of designing a system. Why, when you're designing a system which has integrated knobs, do I want to create more of the most expensive part of that system? Do I want to pay for a toll road that I don't use every day? I don't, but that's what we're doing. According to the ISP, it's 10,000 new kilometers of transmission, right? And if you look at Snowy Hydro 2, where are we? We're $12 billion just on Snowy Hydro 2. Then you need to put all of the transmission on top. For all of that, you're going to get to over $20 billion, all said and done. For an asset that only can generate 2.2 megawatts of power and cannot generate non-stop 365 days in a row. You could really think about nuclear as a battery. If you think about fuel cycle of an AP1000, it's roughly 18 months. I can generate 1.1 gigawatts of power non-stop for 18 months, and then I need to refuel. I should really tie this back to the futures of city, which is to say there will be no futures of the city because if you continuously extract rent from consumers through energy prices, then they become poorer. And when people are poorer, they spend less. Poverty goes up, and we have societal issues. And so linking this back into the future of cities is higher energy prices destroys the future of cities. What ends up happening? You get crime. People will do what they need to do to survive and live. If the environment's going to become hotter and we're going to have more cooling days, right? We're going to have more days of over 40 degrees. Do you want to have to manage your air conditioning because you can't afford to pay your electricity bill? Or do you just want to be able to put it on 24/7 and just not think about it? Personally, I prefer the latter. I think most people do. But it's very telling. We're in a world now where we have electricity subsidies. You only need electricity subsidies if your energy policy's gone wrong. And so bad energy policies, which underwrites everything. If you're using a computer screen at work, if you're using AI to generate some Python code that consumes electricity, all of that just becomes more expensive. And if things become more expensive, you become less competitive. And therefore the cities don't become as creative as they should be. So it all snowballs.
Again, I love that you are talking about not just the cost, but also the values and the second and third consequences.
It's really quite sad that we've gotten to this point because energy is a really slow-moving sector. It takes a long time to get things done, a long time. And so we're going to have a gas shortage, contrary to what all of the left-wing think tanks are telling you. We have a gas shortage in Victoria already. And Meg O'Neill, who's the CEO of Woodside, she was pretty transparent the other day. She essentially said, why do I want to invest in Victoria? Because they own the gas fields that are in the Bass Strait with Esso. Why do I want to invest in Victoria? I can go to the US. And as we say in financial markets, capital goes where it gets treated best. I don't want to go to Victoria. I wouldn't want to invest in Victoria. I've been told endlessly for the last decade that the world is going to end. Fossil fuels are out. We're not doing gas extraction. And guess what's happening? Gas is back, baby. And they're building an LNG terminal in Port Phillip Bay down near Corio in Geelong because they've run out of gas. The world's third biggest LNG exporter has run out of domestic gas. You can't make it up. The only way that happens is policy and politics. That's it. And let me be abundantly clear. Both parties politically have contributed to this energy mess in Australia.
You said that it's quite depressing. For me, it's quite interesting because coming from Hungary, although I have a lot of problems with Hungary, they are using nuclear in Paks and 40% of the whole country's energy comes from nuclear and they are working on a second plant, ? That's a whole another issue, but I know that it works. And that's why it's very interesting how political it has been in Australia. So thank you so much for the description. And although it's quite depressing, it's good to understand the sides and the problems with the communication, what has gone wrong. You mentioned again that this is depressing. Do you see a ray of hope?
There's always hope. Hope never goes away, right? It's just your emotional response to the quantum of hope. Whether you like it or not, I think at the moment, strictly speaking from an energy perspective, we need to see a change of government. A government that is not responsive to its constituents, I think is extraordinary. There was an article, I can't remember which paper it was this week, where Chris Bowen and I think it was Madeleine King essentially told business to get lost. There's nothing wrong with energy prices and our energy policy. We're going to continue to do the same thing. I think that stands in stark contrast to what would happen in the US, which is, hey, this is what we need. And then the government brings all of its resources to the table and they work with industry and they address the issue. For better or worse, we're going to need a change of government because otherwise we will continue down the same track. That's going to be very uncomfortable for people who prioritize the environment, the top of that holy trinity, because we're just going to burn more coal. We're going to have to invest in the coal plants. No one's building gas plants at the moment. There's a couple due to come online, but we're going to need to build a lot more gas as well. So the reality is we're going to need to build a lot more thermal generation. We're going to need to build gas. And we're going to need to reinvest in coal. It's quite simple. It's abundantly clear to me and many other people that's the only possible outcome now. We barely saw an increase in the proportion of energy produced from renewables in 2024 versus 2039. And that correlates with some research out of Japan, which I think was written in 21, which said that the peak amount of renewables in a system would be between 20 and 40%. And then above that, you just require extraordinary amounts of subsidies. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing extraordinary amounts of subsidies, and it's probably not well known, but Chris Bowen's latest subsidy scheme, the Capacity Investment Scheme, as exposed by Aidan Morrison, they have asked AEMO to administer that scheme. And the reason they've done that is so that no one can lodge an FOI request with Chris Bowen's office to get the details of the Capacity Investment Scheme subsidies. So they're all hidden behind AEMO. And to that point, because what Chris Bowen had asked AEMO to do with this subsidy program, they actually had to get South Australia to change the law to enable AEMO to do this. So you can see what's going on here is an extraordinary ideological implementation on energy policy. And so my hope is we see a change of government, because at the end of the day, there is no life without energy. We are using energy right now to talk to each other from different states to record this. There might be a server in the US that's also consuming energy in the US that will be storing all of these details. We're both wearing glasses. How is that made? Plastic comes from oil. Everything we do comes from energy. And so when we start to put the cost of energy up, we shouldn't be surprised that things become more expensive, life becomes more difficult, and people become more poor. So my hope is that we see a change of government. And I know that Peter Dutton is not everyone's cup of tea. But for me, I think Ted O'Brien I think the energy ministers are really the most important ministers right now. And in a debate of Ted O'Brien versus Chris Bowen, For me, it's Ted O'Brien, hands down. And I'm an economics and finance guy. I see a lot of pain ahead if we don't make a change. Economically, we are really struggling. Things are very expensive here, and I think people forget that. And it makes me wonder why people don't pay attention to what's going on in the UK or in Germany or in other areas. Germany's eradicated nuclear and their costs have gone through the roof. They've moved to variable generation. They get bailed out by their neighbours, but that's creating problems. Energy policy just broke apart the Norwegian coalition government. And Norway is now considering not renewing a number of energy connects with Europe and the UK. So can you imagine where Norway, who acts as the battery for Europe because of its extraordinary hydro resources, says to Denmark and effectively to Europe and Germany from 2026, I ain't doing this anymore. If you look at the UK, the lights would go out regularly in the UK if they did not have interconnects with various different parts of Europe, but in particular France. They've got 3 gigawatts of interconnect with France, which is just nuclear, largely. So I think it was 4 or 5 weeks ago, the UK grid almost fell over, but France was providing 3 gigawatts of power. What's happening is with all of these systems, as you increase variability and you remove baseload, what you actually remove from the system is volatility suppression. Nuclear needs to operate. Linking back to the conversation we had around the CSIRO, there's a concept from economics, which is what's the marginal cost, or what's the profit maximizing production rule. And essentially, it's when marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So what does that mean in energy? If you think about it for nuclear, the marginal cost for the US nuclear fleet is about $22 per megawatt hour, give or take for 2023. So let's call that 35 Australian dollars. What that actually really implies is for a nuclear fleet in Australia, it should 100% continue to provide energy into the system down to $35 per megawatt hour. That is providing an extraordinary amount of energy into the system to monetize and to pay back the cost of capital. Now, the benefits also of having a nuclear fleet on the government's balance sheet means not only do you get extraordinarily cheap financing, let's say you need $100 a megawatt hour to repay the loans. You don't need to do that if it's on the government's balance sheet. You do 50 and you could just roll the debt over. And this is the thing that I think people don't realize is it's on the government's balance sheet. You just keep rolling the debt. And who owns the debt? The banks do. So it's fine. And that's what makes it cheap. That's actually what drives prices down as well. Because when you remove baseload, there's no forced supplier in the market. And you see it with variable renewables right now. If you get to the middle of the day and everyone's rooftop solar is going crazy, prices go below zero. The only reason they go below zero, by the way, is because there's subsidies. Otherwise, they wouldn't go below zero. But when there's no solar or when there's no wind, prices go to the moon because there's no forced seller. And that's what baseload to some extent is. It's a forced constant seller. And so what's not very often discussed, and I read a tweet on this, is because you're baseload, you can go to the Australian Stock Exchange and you can forward sell your production by 2 to 3 years. I'm a nuclear operator. I know with a high degree of certainty that, let's say that we have a nuclear plant and it's a gigawatt of capacity. I know with a very high degree of certainty within 2 years' time, so call it 2027, it'd be the March quarter as we would think about it now in financial markets, I'm going to be able to generate at least 500 megawatts of power consistently over that quarter. I can just forward sell that. Variable generators cannot do that. They will get there to some extent, but they can't forward sell 50 or 100% of their production. And so that's where nuclear has its value in the system, which is there is an always-on constant source of supply, which can be forward hedged. And there are people, just like any business, right? Market segmentation. There are organizations that need power 24/7. Everyone knows about data centers. Don't need to talk about that. Steel manufacturers, aluminium smelters, they all need power 24/7. And one of the greatest difficulties for them is not necessarily the absolute level of expense. Yes, absolute counts. Volatility is bad. If I know that my electricity costs are going to be 10% higher, but they're going to stay 10% higher for the next decade, business can respond to that and they can innovate and they can think about ways to try and offset that 10% cost increase. But what's worse for business is greater variability. You can't predict. You don't know what your costs are going to be. And so this is the challenge. And so if you actually go and look at average prices, that's why average prices have been going up in Australia, because we've removed this huge constant supply, which has economies of scale and is very cheap to generate. And we've replaced it by generation sources, to use the phrase, when the sun's shining and when the wind's blowing, they generate. But when there's no sun and there's no wind, there's no energy. And the most valuable energy is the energy you need right now. The Germans went apoplectic in a Dunkelflaut earlier this year because energy prices hit 800 euros per megawatt hour. That's roughly $1,500 per megawatt hour in Australia. We regularly go through that. In fact, Do you know what the maximum level that is allowed? $17,000 per megawatt hour. And we've hit that. So it just gives you a sense that our energy system is far more volatile. Our electricity system is far more volatile than even Germany's. And so this is where the value of nuclear comes in, is you can segment part of the market, you can forward sell your production, you can hedge it, and then when it's on the government balance sheet, you don't have to repay it all within 30 years if you don't want to. And that's where the value versus cost conversation comes in. It's more valuable to society and business to have a generation source that also has all of the frequency and other bits and pieces that comes with it, providing society with stable energy, stable clean energy at whatever the government wants to set it at if it wants. And we just roll the debt over. That's okay.
I think some people would debate your statement on nuclear is clean energy. But on the panel conversation, I learned that, which I haven't known, even though Hungary uses nuclear energy, that 90 to 95% of uranium can be reused, which means that it's breaking recyclable, which is just bonkers.
It's an important point, and I think it's not well understood. The energy's still there, and the reactor that Bill Gates is building will actually solve that problem. So his reactor is what's called a fast reactor, and you'll be able to take what people will refer to as waste and actually put it in his reactor. And they will take that waste, and that will be the fuel for their reactor to actually generate electricity. So you actually get to what's called a closed fuel cycle. And there's another business which is Sam Altman actually chairs called Oklo. They're using a similar concept.
Which is just very hopeful that we have those technologies already building up. That means that not necessarily the huge amount of waste which we are fearing regarding nuclear is coming down the line with these new plants. Andrew, you have been very generous with your time and answers, and I want to be respectful of your afternoon. So what is your role in establishing the future of cities?
I would like to continue to advocate for nuclear. I think if we're going to have clean energy and energy that is abundant and cheap and getting to that value point, which is, it might take 30 years to pay off, might take 40 years to pay off, but then that's going to last 80 years, might even last 100 years. An asset that lasts that long and provides extraordinarily cheap energy is really creating a trust fund almost for my kids and your kids and their kids to grow up in an environment where energy is clean, it's abundant, and it's cheap. And I guess the other aspect is that I'd like to segregate between activism and advocacy. I think they're two very different things. But one thing I think we seem to have moved away from a lot as well in terms of future decisions is thinking about economics. We've really lost the ability to use economics and think about finance to get to the right decisions. And we've got to start paying more attention to economic signals. And so that's one of the things where I think in terms of the future of cities, paying more heed to economics. And that doesn't necessarily mean doing everything for a profit, by the way. One of the things that you'll often discuss at university or at business school is even if you have something that's looking like it's going to make a loss, there's still societal value in governments undertaking some of those projects. And that's why we need government. But we also need to understand the economics of what those costs are. And we should debate them. And we need to get into an environment where we can have these debates without being called a science denier or all of the other fancy labels that come with it. I'd really like future to be one that is abundant with clean energy and where we can have civilized debates and we can actually have a constructive view of each other. And let's think about not just tomorrow or next year or the year after. And let's not just focus on the cost. Let's also focus on the value of things. I guess I started off talking about London to some extent. They built the tube 100 years ago. It's still going. And it's awesome. It moves so many people. It's extraordinary. Peak time on some of those lines, there's a tube almost every 30 to 45 seconds. And they're full. And that's the value. That's the value. And we've got to push through some of these difficult things. Get back to economics. Let's get back to long-term thinking. And think about value, not cost.
And please keep up this good work because it's very important. And for example, I need to learn to think through economics. My university education included some economics classes, but those just frightened me of economics, which is really good. We need to think about the future and not just the cost, but the value of these investments. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
Keep an open mind to new technology. There's a lot of people who, in this day and age, will use social media and marketing manipulation to try and make you think in a specific way. But if you keep an open mind and you do your own fact checking with the tools that are available today for free, I think you can quite quickly get to a factual outcome and a better understanding of what people are saying. I think with the nuclear debate, nuclear is not a new technology. It's in operation overseas. We use it for all sorts of different things. When we walk outside, we get radiation. So you have to ask yourself the simple question. When you eat a banana, a single banana, and you get more radiation from that banana than you do from living next to a nuclear plant for a year, are people who are screaming at you about radiation exposure being bad, do they have your best interests at heart? Do they have the future? Have they really thought about the future that well? Because making a decision based on fear, I don't think has ever come to the right conclusion. So keep an open mind, do your own fact checking. Don't listen to me. I've spent too much time in this topic. Just read. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you, Fanny.
It was really interesting to hear from Andrew about the misconceptions regarding financing nuclear energy, not to mention his dedication to abundant energy. Boyd Cohen talked about abundance capitalism in episode 246. You can find out more about Andrew online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Andrew's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?